The Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Book the First, which treats of the night of sense. Stanza the first. On a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings, oh, happy chance! I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest. Exposition. In this first stanza, the soul relates the way and manner which it followed in going forth, as to its affection, from itself and from all things, and in dying to them all, and to itself, by means of true mortification, in order to attain to living the sweet and delectable life of love with God. And it says that this going forth from itself, and from all things, was a dark night, by which, as will be explained hereafter, is here understood purgative contemplation, which causes passively in the soul the negation of itself and of all things referred to above. And this going forth, it says here, that it was able to accomplish in the strength and ardor which love for its spouse gave to it for that purpose, in the dark contemplation aforementioned. Herein it extols the great happiness which it found in journeying to God through this night, with such signal success that none of the three enemies, which are the world, the devil, and the flesh, who are they who ever impede this road, could hinder it, inasmuch as the aforementioned night of purgative contemplation, lulled to sleep and mortified, in the house of its sensuality, all the passions and desires, with respect to their mischievous desires and motions. The line then says, on a dark night. Chapter 1 sets down the first line and begins to treat of the imperfections of beginners. Into this dark night souls begin to enter, when God draws them forth from the state of beginners, which is the state of those that meditate upon the spiritual road, and begins to set them in the state of progressives, which is that of those who are already contemplatives, to the end that after passing through it, they may arrive at the state of the perfect, which is that of the divine union of the soul with God. Wherefore, to the end that we may the better understand and explain what night is this through which the soul passes, and for what cause God sets it therein, it will be well here to touch first of all upon certain characteristics of beginners, which, although we treat them with all possible brevity, will not fail to be of service likewise to the beginners themselves, in order that, realizing the weakness of the state wherein they are, they may take courage, and may desire that God will bring them into this night, wherein the soul is strengthened and confirmed in the virtues, and made ready for the inestimable delights of the love of God. And although we may tarry here for a time, it will not be for longer than is necessary, so that we may go on to speak at once of this dark night. It must be known, then, that the soul, after it has been definitely converted to the service of God, is, as a rule, spiritually nurtured and caressed by God, even as is the tender child by its loving mother, who warms it with the heat of her bosom, and nurtures it with sweet milk and soft and pleasant food, and carries it and caresses it in her arms. But as the child grows bigger, the mother gradually ceases caressing it, and hiding her tender love, puts bitter aloes upon her sweet breast, sets down the child from her arms, and makes it walk upon its feet, so that it may lose the habits of a child, and betake itself to more important and substantial occupations. The loving mother is like the grace of God, for as soon as the soul is regenerated by its new warmth and fervor for the service of God, He treats it in the same way. He makes it to find spiritual milk sweet and delectable in all the things of God without any labor of its own, and also great pleasure in spiritual exercises. For here God is giving to it the breast of his tender love, even as to a tender child. Therefore such a soul finds its delight in spending long periods, perchance whole nights, in prayer. Penances are its pleasures, fasts its joys, and its consolations are to make use of the sacraments and to occupy itself in divine things. In the which things spiritual persons, though taking part in them with great efficacy and persistence, and using and treating them with great care, often find themselves, spiritually speaking, very weak and imperfect. For since they are moved to these things and to these spiritual exercises by the consolation and pleasure they find in them, and since, too, they have not been prepared for them by the practice of earnest striving in the virtues, they have many faults and imperfections with respect to these spiritual actions of theirs. For after all, any man's actions correspond to the habit of perfection attained by him. And as these persons have not had the opportunity of acquiring the said habits of strength, they have necessarily to work like feebler children, feebly. In order that this may be seen more clearly, and likewise how much these beginners in the virtues lack with respect to the works in which they so readily engage with the pleasure aforementioned, we shall describe it by reference to the 7 capital sins, each in its turn indicating some of the many imperfections which they have under each heading, wherein it will be clearly seen how like to children are these persons in all they do. And it will also be seen how many blessings the dark night, of which we shall afterwards treat, brings with it, since it cleanses the soul and purifies it from all these imperfections. Chapter 2. Of certain spiritual imperfections which beginners have with respect to the habit of pride. As these beginners feel themselves to be very fervent and diligent in spiritual things and devout exercises, from this prosperity, although it is true that holy things of their own nature cause humility, there often comes to them through their imperfections a certain kind of secret pride, whence they come to have some degree of satisfaction with their works and with themselves. And hence there comes to them likewise a certain desire, which is somewhat vain, and at times very vain, to speak of spiritual things in the presence of others, and sometimes even to teach such things rather than learn them. They condemn others in their heart when they see that they have not the kind of devotion which they themselves desire, and sometimes they even say this in words, herein resembling the Pharisee, who boasted of himself, praising God for his own good works, and despising the publican. In these persons the devil often increases the fervor that they have, and the desire to perform these and other works more frequently, so that their pride and presumption grow greater. For the devil knows quite well that all these works and virtues which they perform are not only valueless to them, but even become vices in them. And such a degree of evil are some of these persons wont to reach, that they would have none appear good except themselves. And thus, in deed and word, whenever the opportunity occurs, they condemn others and slander them, beholding the mote in their brother's eye, and not considering the beam which is in their own. They strain at another's gnat, and themselves swallow a camel. Sometimes, too, when their spiritual masters, such as confessors and superiors, do not approve of their spirit and behavior, for they are anxious that all they do shall be esteemed and praised, they consider that they do not understand them, or that because they do not approve of this and comply with that, their confessors are themselves not spiritual. and so they immediately desire and contrive to find someone else who will fit in with their tastes. For as a rule, they desire to speak of spiritual matters with those who they think will praise and esteem what they do. And they flee as they would from death, from those who disabuse them, in order to lead them into a safe road. Sometimes they even harbor ill will against them. Presuming thus, they are wont to resolve much and accomplish very little. Sometimes they are anxious that others shall realize how spiritual and devout they are, to which end they occasionally give outward evidence thereof, in movements, sighs, and other ceremonies. And at times they are apt to fall into certain ecstasies in public rather than in secret, wherein the devil aids them, and they are pleased that this should be noticed, and are often eager that it should be noticed more. Many such persons desire to be the favorites of their confessors, and to become intimate with them, as a result of which there beset them continual occasions of envy and disquiet. They are too much embarrassed to confess their sins nakedly, lest their confessors should think less of them. So they palliate them and make them appear less evil, and thus it is to excuse themselves rather than to accuse themselves that they go to confession. And sometimes they seek another confessor to tell the wrongs that they have done, so that their own confessor shall think that they have done nothing wrong at all, but only good. And thus they always take pleasure in telling him what is good, and sometimes in such terms as to make it appear to be greater than it is rather than less, desiring that he may think them to be good, when it would be greater humility in them, as we shall say, to depreciate it, and to desire that neither he nor anyone else should consider them of account. Some of these beginners, too, make little of their faults, and at other times become over-sad when they see themselves fall into them, thinking themselves to have been saints already, and thus they become angry and impatient with themselves, which is another imperfection. Often they beseech God with great yearnings that he will take from them their imperfections and faults, but they do this so that they may find themselves at peace, and may not be troubled by them, rather than for God's sake, not realizing that if he should take their imperfections from them, they would probably become prouder and more presumptuous still. They dislike praising others, and love to be praised themselves. Sometimes they seek out such praise. Herein they are like the foolish virgins, who when their lamps could not be lit, sought oil from others. From these imperfections, some souls go on to develop many very grave ones, which do them very great harm. But some have fewer, and some more, and some only the first motions thereof, or little beyond these. And there are hardly any such beginners who at the time of these signs of fervor do not fall into some of these errors. But those who at this time are going on to perfection proceed very differently, and with quite another temper of spirit. For they progress by means of humility, and are greatly edified not only of thinking nothing of their own affairs, but having very little satisfaction with themselves. They consider all others as far better, and usually have a holy envy of them, and an eagerness to serve God as they do. For the greater is their fervor, and the more numerous are the works that they perform, and the greater is the pleasure that they take in them as they progress in humility, the more do they realize how much God deserves from them, and how little is all that they do for his sake, and thus the more they do, the less they're satisfied. So much would they gladly do from charity and love for him that all they do seems to them nothing. And so greatly are they importuned, occupied, and absorbed by this loving anxiety, that they never notice what others do or don't do. Or, if they do notice it, they always believe, as I say, that all others are far better than they themselves. Wherefore, holding themselves as of little worth, they are anxious that others too should thus hold them, and should despise and depreciate that which they do. And further, if men should praise and esteem them, they can in no wise believe what they say. It seems to them strange that anyone should say these good things of them. Together with great tranquillity and humbleness, these souls have a deep desire to be taught by anyone who can bring them profit. They are the complete opposite of those of whom we have spoken above, who would be eager to be always teaching, and who, when others seem to be teaching them, take the words from their mouths as if they knew them already. These souls, on the other hand, being far from desiring to be the masters of anyone, are very ready to travel and set out on another road than that which they are actually following, if they be so commanded, because they never think that they are right in anything whatsoever. They rejoice when others are praised. They grieve only because they do not serve God like them. They have no desire to speak of the things which they do, because they think so little of them that they are ashamed to speak of them even to their spiritual masters, since they seem to them to be things that do not merit being spoken of. They are more anxious to speak of their faults and sins, or that these should be recognized rather than their virtues. And thus they incline to talk of their souls with those who account their actions and their spirituality of little value. This is a characteristic of the spirit which is simple, pure, genuine, and very pleasing to God. For as the wise Spirit of God dwells in these humble souls, he moves them and inclines them to keep his treasures secretly within, and likewise to cast out from themselves all evil. God gives this grace to the humble, together with the other virtues, even as he denies it to the proud. These souls will give their heart's blood to anyone that serves God, and will help others to serve him as much as in them lies. The imperfections into which they see themselves fall, they bear with humility, meekness of spirit, and a loving fear of God, hoping in him. But souls who in the beginning journey with this kind of perfection are, as I understand, and as has been said, a minority, and very few are those who we can be glad do not fall into the opposite errors. For this reason, as we shall afterwards say, God leads into the dark night those whom he desires to purify from all these imperfections, so that he may bring them farther onward. End of Chapter 2 of Book 1.